than just, growing something and eating something, but it's growing in some place. It's moving to lots of places, and that's the global part. Sometimes ingredients come from very different places. And then who gets to eat what is a little bit of a global question as well, because the decisions made about how the land and water is used in one place will affect all the people around there and whether or not they're getting food that they used to get or whether they're importing something from somewhere else.
What is food security?
It's a really important and yet somewhat abstract concept, and much more commonly in conversation, people talk about hunger, and hunger is in the end the core part of it. But food security is about not going hungry. It's about whole communities and countries not going hungry. In some level, it's about the right to food that we recognize as humans, that's something we ought to care for and pay attention to. And it's also a crucial part of any state's political stability, what holds a country together. To be legitimate, a government has to ensure that people don't go hungry. And one of the ways that governments fall is because that fails for whatever reason. The system they had in place, the way in which people were getting their food, if that fails, then that will throw the whole legitimacy of a government into question. Another important thing about food security is it's been something we've been able to add important ideas to. So you first see the term being used by governments in the early 1970s. Big hunger, at that time famine is affecting Bangladesh, actually big food scarcities in what was the USSR. And the idea is really a fear that there's not enough supply for the population. It's a time where people are also very worried about population growth. And then over time, from the 70s into the 80s, you start to say, well, people go hungry even when there's plenty. And that's a reality we know in the richest country on earth in many ways, where the fact is people can't afford to buy what's available, or even if they can afford food, they can't also afford rent, can't also afford other things, education. And so they end up making choices where they cut back on their food, maybe skip a day, maybe skip 2 days if you're the mom, so that either the food goes further in the family or so that you can make something like a rent payment, big amount of money all at once, where the food is a little bit of money every day. And then into the 90s, we started to talk about nutrition. You need other things as well. You need sanitation. Otherwise, you're chronically ill. You're not going to get the benefit of your food. You need the food to be good quality. There's a lot of poor quality food out there. And so many people, women, for example, suffer from anemia. They might suffer from insufficient zinc or iodine. Iodine's critical to human health. And these trace elements seem so simple, but if they're not a part of your diet, then people suffer cognitively, people suffer from the just physical strength and well-being. And so we finally come into the 2000s, and really at the end of the 1990s, in fact, the UN definition of food security is access to sufficient, nutritious, and culturally appropriate food at all times. And there's this notion that it is not just now, but into the future, because people who have plenty of food on their table, but aren't sure that next month or next year that they will, they're also living in food insecurity. Their thinking is preoccupied by making sure that access will come. We've had availability, we've had access, then nutrition. The fourth ability is this, I would call it sustainability. It's often called stability, but that is about being able to afford it. We've seen how price inflation has caused a lot of disruption in people's lives, but also sustainable in terms of water, in terms of weather, in terms of not having climate disruption, conflict. Oftentimes within a country, local communities know who's hungry, and you'll find churches or local organizations, Rotary, they'll organize to make sure food's available. And we don't really have a space for those communities to talk about food even. So this area of really local governance, I think, is underdeveloped, and the food security is one of those places. It brings people together, it overcomes a lot of differences, and that money eventually, or that investment we want to make as a public, it needs a voice from there. Agency is a really important part of food security. People being able to decide and choose and to feel secure because they have a bit of control.
What factors are threatening global food security?
If we live in the US, we're not invaded by another country. We have a lot of money actually that we spend in the public budget on food security, but we don't do a great job in achieving things. And so we could do a lot better in making sure people eat well. But if you're in the Sahel, for example, the region of Africa that suffers from intense and frequent drought, you have a different set of issues. But the big global causes of hunger at the moment are climate change, disrupting weather patterns, both drought and floods, but also just severe weather events. And to say that's not just about whether or not the crop will grow or the livestock survive, but also whether you'll be able to ship the food. The Panama Canal has been in the news this last year or two because of inadequate water. Therefore, the ships aren't floating. Therefore, the canal is much reduced in its capacity. So you have climate change, you have conflict, probably the biggest proximate cause of hunger, always has been, and sadly, perhaps will be into the future. That conflict disrupts people, of course, by disrupting people's ability to plant, ability to move food around, ability to get food to regions. It's disrupting our global supply chains. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the economic sanctions put in place as in response, that has disrupted massive exports from two big food exporting countries, both Russia and Ukraine. But you've also got conflict in places like Darfur, where that the hunger is much more intense in a lot of places where the conflict is civil rather than between two states. And then I think just more broadly than climate change, you have all of the things you might group loosely under biodiversity, or the fact that we're not allowing a lot of microorganisms to thrive in the soil, that we're not protecting our water systems and all of the services that water system, both freshwater and oceans, provide. These are all things that are also changing and in some ways undermining at least the way the food systems have been until now. They're changing very fast as a result of these pressures.
What role does the United States play in global food security?
The U.S. has historically, when I say that, sort of late 19th century, much of the 20th century, it's been you could say, granary to the world. I wouldn't say it's fed the world exactly, but the amazing capacity for food production, the kind of land clearing that happened, and then the creation of big farms with a lot of technology, a lot of research that went into high yielding varieties, as they're called. The U.S. did produce a lot of food, especially wheat, and some other crops, and it came to play quite an important role in a lot of countries globally as a huge wheat supplier, and then more corn and then soy. In today's world, a lot of what we grow here isn't food at all, I would say. It's feed, and then increasingly it's been biofuel, feedstock. So it's been actually a food system that's moved away into producing more sort of agricultural commodities for industry and less food that people might eat every day and recognize as food on their table. It's gone into animals that we wouldn't be the number of animals without that feed, but there were animals that were grazing before, but now we've changed their diets. So there's a U.S. role in international markets as a big supplier that has gradually been lessening as we grow other things instead. There's an important role. I mean, as a subcontinent, the U.S. is able to grow a huge amount of food for itself, but we actually are a net food importer. That means we spend more on food imports than we earn from the export. That's a new thing for the United States. And we've come to increasingly depend on food imports, especially for these high value things, seafood, fruit and vegetables, things that demand a more involved food supply chain. There's more food safety hazards. They need more energy to keep them fresh. As we've changed our diets and started to eat more foods all the time, every day, less seasonally, we've seen a big increase in the value of the imports of the food that the US eats. And a third way in which the US government in particular plays a role is as a very large donor to the United Nations, as an important member of many UN bodies, as a very big donor through the USAID, its International Assistance Program. That means the US is also influential in terms of shaping how other countries invest in their food systems, in their trade systems related to food as well. So the US has been an important actor in that international conversation about what a good food security strategy might look like, because it's a big donor. It comes with resources to that conversation. The US is inclined to say you just need to increase production and free up the markets, and this will work. And from my point of view, living here, I think that could use a little bit of self-reflection on how well is that actually working for Americans? And would it work then for other countries if we're not satisfied? I'm not satisfied with what we achieve here. I would like to get that fixed before we take it abroad as a model.
What role does China play in global food security?
China stands out as a very populous country, obviously, that has had a firm and several thousand-year commitment to food security as a top-level public priority. China's approach to food security has shifted from around 2000, I would say, where it was always very intent on being entirely self-sufficient. It has become quite a big importer of food and also quite a big exporter of some foods. And it has maintained, I think, a deep commitment to national sufficiency, which for the rest of the world is probably a good thing because it would import a lot of food otherwise, and it would have, more purchasing power than a lot of developing countries would have. But that attitude, I think, is also useful or important in relation to these international or multilateral conversations, because China comes with an orientation and a commitment to food security being important. So, for example, as it invests in Africa, as a continent, it's been an important investor there. There's a lot of discussion back and forth about the nature of those investments and the extent to which they're creating indebtedness. Of course, even our so-called aid creates a lot of debt as well. But I feel that the government comes with a very pragmatic but committed attitude to where food security lies in that order of priorities, and have been willing, for example, to say we're not going to export food out of the continent of Africa because that's not what should come to us. They've been extracting minerals and other things, but not food. I would say that it brings a slightly different attitude and a much more conscious commitment to food security as a priority.
How can the US and China shape the future of global food security?
Both these countries now hold a great deal of debt owed by other countries. And if there were a way, as has been pushed around climate change, but I feel even more urgently around food security, that was willing to look at just debt cancellation in exchange for investment in domestic food systems, I think that would be something that would cost little to these two major powers, and that would be a huge act of goodwill that, would be humanitarian, but would also let those countries move past hunger, move into other kinds of urgently needed economic investment. So I would make a plea to them as debt holders. And one of our challenges at the moment is that our international finance is disrupted by a rebalancing of power in which we're not yet clear how it'll come out, but it's not the post-war world anymore. And rightly, China, Brazil, other countries are taking a bigger role. But where that lands, it would be great if that landed in a place that was willing to treat certain human rights, like the right to food in particular, as something to uphold. So that aside, I think it's also a time, we just have elected a new administration in the US that is more aggressive about domestic development, America first, a kind of unwillingness to engage in foreign entanglements as they're seen. And from some points of view, that's disappointing to an organization like ours that is interested in international relations, but it does perhaps speak to a time where this argument about what we would call food sovereignty, that countries cannot be sovereign if they do not have control of their food system. That doesn't mean they have to do it all at home, but they need to afford what they're buying on the international market. They shouldn't be sort of going into debt in order to buy that food. That's not sovereign. Maybe there's some space for that argument to say the international system needs to make room for all to be able to do that investment in their domestic economy. I think China has never said otherwise. That's been its priority. It may be this US administration would respect some of that argument and approach, that this is about how countries make themselves strong and robust. And I would just say in a last thought that a lot of things that were bipartisan in the US in the past are stretched beyond possibility. Even agreement on a farm bill, which is how the US actually shapes both its food security interventions and its agriculture. But it's always been one of the issues on which it's been easier to find agreement than most. And maybe that's one of the areas where this Congress will make food security and food investment an interesting area for them to seek a way to move forward, where other issues are more ideologically vastly more separated.
The Mekong River is a food basket for the world. It feeds tens of millions of people in mainland Southeast Asia. The food, the rice, the fish, the shrimp that are produced there get exported all over Asia, and they make their way to the supermarkets in the United States. So you will not find a supermarket without a product from the Mekong region. It's one of the most productive and impressive river systems in the world.
How is water security in one region a global issue?
The Mekong River runs from China all the way through 5 countries downstream in Southeast Asia, a portion of Myanmar, most of Laos, some of Thailand, most of Cambodia, and then goes into the ocean in Vietnam's Mekong Delta. And that Mekong Delta particularly is important for global food production. In the United States, most of the markets that you go to, the supermarkets, and not just the Asian markets, like H Mart or Latte, nearly all the supermarkets and all the cities and towns of the United States have fish or rice or some product from the Mekong Delta. And that productivity of Vietnam's Mekong Delta is being threatened by a lot of changes being introduced to the Mekong Basin.
What factors threaten water security in the Mekong region?
So just to look at the importance of what comes from the Mekong River for the people of the Mekong, because I think that's the most important priority to emphasize, that tens of millions of people rely on natural resources, fish, water, agricultural productivity that's provided by the Mekong's flood pulse. So that means during the wet season, there's a lot of seasonal inundation or flooding, good flooding, productive flooding, not the kind of flooding that we saw, say, brought by Hurricane Helene and Asheville, but just normal month-long flooding that provides water throughout the year and creates the conditions for making the Mekong, say, the world's largest fishery for freshwater fish, responsible for 20% of the world's freshwater fish production. And again, that fish production feeds the people of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, and others. That flood pulse is being threatened by both some changes in climate patterns. We're seeing that wet seasons are less wet. They are more intense. So the Mekong is getting rain and storms like we saw with, say, Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton here this year. But at the same time, there's just less precipitation overall, and that's changing the nature of that flood pulse. And then upstream dams, they're also having an effect. And there are a lot of dams now, over 700 of them, some large, some small, but they also have an effect on bringing down the flood pulse during the wet season, and that reduces the seasonal inundation or the seasonal flooding. There are other factors, but these are the two big ones, that the climate is changing and dams are delivering their impacts in a negative way.
Are the issues that face the Mekong unique?
Well, the Mekong is unique because of its flood pulse. A lot of rivers have flood pulse systems, but the Mekong has the Tonle Sap Lake, which is the largest lake in Southeast Asia that normally feeds into the Mekong mainstream via a river. The connection happens at Phnom Penh in Cambodia. But during the wet season, when that flood pulse is happening, that heartbeat of the Mekong is happening, the river that normally feeds into the Mekong mainstream from that lake reverses direction, and it pushes water back up into that lake, causing it to expand 5 times its normal size. And 60 times the amount of water that's in there during the dry season goes in during the wet season. It's an amazing thing, and it's a miracle of the Mekong. It's really what makes the river system unique. And that expansion or that heartbeat that you can see on satellite mapping, and people there see it very clearly. They live on stilted homes so that they can have livelihoods and exist and adapt to their surroundings during the wet season to see the waters rise and fall. That's what produces the Mekong's mighty fish catch. And then also when that lake drains, it sends water down into the Mekong Delta to provide for irrigation during and into the dry season. So this is really unique for a river. Again, other rivers have these flood pulse effects, but nothing like that lake interaction and a huge floodplain that essentially makes up all of Cambodia and a significant portion of Vietnam.
What is the role of the United States and China in the Mekong region?
So saying that the United States is an ocean away, that's correct. China is not far removed from the Mekong. China is part of the Mekong. So the way that China acts in the Mekong and its portion of the Mekong River determines downstream outcomes. I would argue China is not invested in the health of the Mekong River. China's dams and the Mekong Dam Monitor, which I co-lead, shows very clearly how those dams are ruining the Mekong flood pulse. I mean, at times they can reduce the flood pulse by 20% all the way downstream during certain months. And that's a significant reduction. So China should be invested in the health of the river. China should be invested in Cambodia's food security and Vietnam's economic security for the Mekong Delta. But clearly it's not. And all the evidence shows that. The United States, on the contrary, is very much interested in supporting these ecological benefits that the Mekong provides to the downstream, and supporting efforts which bring science and evidence to policymakers to demonstrate why it's important to preserve these ecological features like that flood pulse and like the expansion of the Tonle Sap Lake. And that aligns well with the Mekong River Commission's position on the lower Mekong and floodplains. The Mekong River Commission is an intergovernmental body made up of member countries, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And their charter, the Mekong Agreement, prioritizes the health of that Tonle Sap Lake and the Mekong flood pulse. So all those countries are aligned. It would be great if China were more aligned with that particular position. But in fact, China runs in opposition to that position, which is unfortunate. However, in recent years, there's been a lot more dialogue between the downstream countries and the upstream in supporting the joint operations of the river. So that would be using dams together for joint purposes and priorities. Now, I hope that those conversations, which again, they're led by the downstream and China, I don't see a lot of external pushing and prodding to say, hey, this should happen from the outside. It is really a homegrown effort. I hope that those conversations can convince and bring evidence to the upstream that, say, the flood pulse is extremely important. But we haven't seen that yet. We have seen them talking about joint operations and more collaboration and more cooperation. Indeed, a good thing.
What can the United States and China do to keep the Mekong healthy?
Well, I think that US and China should have dialogues about the importance of the health of the river. There's a lot of changes coming from inside of China about how China's own domestic rivers and wetlands and floodplains are. We're seeing things like sponge cities being prioritized in China, and floodplain restoration and nature-based solutions. I mean, these are all things that the US pushes in Southeast Asia and around the world too. So there is alignment there within China, potential alignment. But China's foreign policy to its neighbors or to, far-flung parts of the world does not reflect kind of the own internal changes that are happening within China itself. Maybe that will come someday. And perhaps the more dialogue between the US and China can be useful in influencing the way that China's environmentalists and China's scientists talk about the rest of the world.
We wear more than just clothes. We also wear the global economy, public policy, or even trade politics that jointly make fashionable and also safe and affordable clothing available to hardworking families. Each year, the global fashion industry generates more than $4 trillion. And you can imagine how many economic and job opportunities that are associated or created by our sector.
Where do fast fashion garments sold to U.S. consumers come from?
Fashion is possible because of international trade. When we talk about the process of making a garment, actually it can be far more complicated than we thought. Now, for example, just use the most simple product, t-shirt, right? It's such a simple product. But actually, to make into a t-shirt, we will first need to have cotton, the fiber, then have yarn, then have fabrics, then have the finished cut and sew process, and also the like the buttons or even the label. And each of these components can come from different countries. So the clothing can come from China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Mexico, Italy, and also USA, you name it. But that's not the end of the story. Actually, when we dig deep into the clothing, we find some additional very interesting phenomena. The label says it's made in Mexico, but using US fabrics. Or even made in Bangladesh, they say the fabric is imported. So this kind of phenomenon really reminds us apparel is more than just about the label, made in, but actually it is made in the world, or multiple countries actually get involved in making the products, or we call it, it's made anywhere in the world and sold anywhere in the world. So now you can imagine how sophisticated the supply chain can be. Don't forget these non-manufacturing functions that are involved in making these products possible. We have a very vibrant and robust U.S. textile and apparel industry. We no longer make a lot of apparel here, but when you shop, at a retail store, the clothing, even though it says it's sourced from Asia, but the idea of this clothing, the pattern, the design actually happened in the U.S. The clothing is licensed by a U.S.-based company. It's a U.S. brand, and we purchase it from a U.S.-based retail store. So of course, all these functions create value, and they create very well-paid, decent jobs. 70 to 80% of the value of an imported garment, they're created in the U.S. We often say, oh, export create jobs, export support U.S. jobs. But I want to say import can also support the U.S. economy. Import can also create well-paid non-manufacturing jobs.
Why is fast fashion a global concern?
So we know, fast fashion really enjoying substantial growth over the past decades. And somehow I don't think it is too surprising because these fast fashion retailers really offer the products consumers want. Because of the expansion of the fast fashion phenomenon, there's some new global issue. One is labor. Apparel is a labor-intensive industry. We're talking about apparel trade and sourcing, but actually we're also talking about the people behind making of such products. One distinct feature of fast fashion product is they're cheap. As a consumers, we love to see more affordable products, but the question is if we got the product at such a low price, or if fast fashion retailers price such product at such a low price, how much these workers who are making such products can get paid? Are they fairly treated? I don't think any consumers would like to see somebody is risking their lives making clothing for us, or the working condition there really is below the bottom line. So this is how the growing of fast fashion really raised people's awareness of social responsibility. Issues like forced labor, child labor, they're becoming more and more visible these days because consumers, we care about these issues. Okay, so that's number one. Number two is the environmental impact of fast fashion. Fast fashion really create this kind of culture, really encourage consumers to keep purchasing new clothing. They want to offer fresh items, not even just every week, but even every day, every hour. They just psychologically give a lot of incentive for consumers to keep purchasing. But we should not forget about how to deal with these used clothing. Each year, I think at least millions of tons of used clothing was generated, just in the US alone. But the problem is most of them still have no perfect solution to be dealt with. The scale of textile recycling is still very small. The vast majority of used clothing, they have to be either be dumped or be burned. So they will create huge environmental impact on our planet. Fast fashion products, they need to control their production cost. So one way to do that is to use relatively cheap textile materials. Such products will be even more challenging to be recycled after consumer just simply dump them or throw them away. These days, more and more countries, especially in Europe, they began to launch or to implement more restrictive environmental related regulations. And many of such regulations directly target the fast fashion industry. These movements push them to also to pay more attention to the labor or to the environmental impact of their business operation.
What role does the United States play in the global fast fashion industry?
People may not realize U.S. remains the fourth largest textile exporter in the world. So here I'm talking about products like fiber, yarn, and fabrics, especially fiber and yarn. U.S. remains one of the world's leading manufacturer and exporter. The reason is making such products is very capital and technology intensive. If you go to these factories, you seldom see people. Actually, they're all sophisticated machinery. Textile products don't have to be just about yarn and fabrics for apparel manufacturing purposes. They can be high-tech industrial textiles, medical textiles, or even PPE. During COVID, we need a lot of PPE, and they're actually textile products. So actually, U.S. remains one of the world's leading producer and exporter of such products. And surely there are a lot of economic impact of the U.S. textile sector, and also a lot of important and well-paid jobs be created by our sector. When we import apparel from Central America, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, or Mexico, very likely they will use US-made yarn and fabrics. So that's number one. Number two is US is one of the largest apparel consumption market in the world. And I have to say, apparel is a buyer-driven industry, meaning what products retailers will put on the sales floor or ask manufacturers to make really depends on what products we want. And this is a huge opportunity. Why? Because as I mentioned earlier, the fast fashion industry raised the issue of sustainability, raised the issue of the environmental impact. But what if, through better education, or when US consumers, they're more aware of these global implications of making and selling or even consuming fast fashion products. We want to see fashion companies pay more attention to this issue. So you have to show me how you treat your workers. You have to show me what is the specific or scientific-based environmental impact of making your products, how many carbon emission it's generated, how about the water usage, or do you have any plan to deal with textile waste? Or I really want to see some of the textile materials used in the garments, they're recycled. When US consumers, they're better educated, they're more aware of these bigger issues associated with the fast fashion industry, they can call for fashion brands and retailers to make some positive changes. And actually, I think this is happening. I often say, fashion companies, they're not just like a very abstract concept. They're composed of people. And our students will be future leaders for the fashion industry. I'm very impressed working with them to see how passionate they feel about sustainability, how passionate they care about workers, their rights, how they're treated, and they want to really make the fashion industry or the world a better place to live. So I'm pretty confident when they become industry professionals, when they decide where to source their products or what kind of products they want to bring to the US store, some positive changes will be happening. So in the future, I'm sure we will see the supply chain become more sustainable, or the sourcing criteria will really give more emphasis on issues like sustainability and social responsibility.
What role does China play in the global fast fashion industry?
China remains the world's largest apparel producer and exporter. More than 1/3 of US apparel imports in quantity still came from China. If you're looking at, we know increasingly US companies, they source more products from Vietnam, from Bangladesh, from Cambodia, Pakistan, India. But also these countries, they're using more and more textile raw materials coming from China. China's role in the apparel supply chain is evolving, expanding from just being an apparel exporting countries to increasingly becoming a textile raw material supplier to many Asia-based apparel exporting countries. So surely China has a huge impact on the apparel sector. Furthermore, because of the growth of the China's economy and also, when Chinese consumers, they have more discretionary spending. So China itself is becoming a very important consumption market. Okay, if you visit China, especially these tier 1 cities like Shanghai, Beijing, we can really see a lot of Western brands out there, including fast fashion brands. Because of more consumption of clothing there, the same issue that happened in many Western markets, that is how to treat textile waste, becoming more kind of serious concern in China. For some African countries, China is now becoming one of the leading source of used clothing. Okay, so you can really see China's shifting role or more sophisticated impact on the apparel industry. China will continue creating opportunities and also challenges for the apparel sector. Countries like Bangladesh, Cambodia, how they can really leverage China to export more of their apparel products, right? How to really leverage China to achieve so-called trade-led economic growth. The environmental impact of apparel consumed in China down the road will also attract more attention or need more attention.
How can the US and China work together to address issues with the global fashion industry?
The US-China relationship, especially in the trade area, definitely have a lot of concerns. Well, that being said, despite the very challenging relationship, the stake remains very high. Each year, truly billions of dollars of textile and apparel trade happen between the two countries. And also, as I explained earlier, kind of both countries are expanding their role in the apparel supply chain. China being increasingly an important textile supplier to other countries, or China is also expanding its used clothing exports. So truly, I think the U.S.-China textile and apparel trade itself, or the stability of the U.S.-China textile and apparel trade, still matters a lot to both countries, and also definitely to a lot of workers behind this very sophisticated supply chain. I think both countries truly can contribute to many grand challenges facing our society. And these challenges don't require you have to choose a side to say, what kind of economic system you will like to adopt, because these issues are mankind challenges, things like climate change, how to really further reduce the environmental impact of making and consuming apparel products. We all care about the environment. We definitely want our future generations to suffer too many negative impact of our behavior, our activity. There's some potential area, even though they're a little bit more sensitive, but still it's great to at least have dialogue, have conversations, things like, the labor standards, because I think as human beings, nobody wants to see somebody else is risking their lives making clothing for us. We all want, the clothing sector to be an opportunity to generate well-paid and decent job, and that can lead to robust economic growth. We can do more to set some acceptable universal standards on social responsibility, on transparency, to ensure fashion companies or producers to share more data with the public, to let us know about what's happening behind the making of the garment. I think there are a lot of opportunities. I would love to see the U.S.-China textile and apparel trade continue to play a very important role, to be an opportunity for a lot of people getting involved in the supply chain, and of course benefit consumers as well.
There is a feeling, I think, that in the past, US administrations have moved in and made a lot of promises, and then the administration changes, and then you get a very different sort of thing. So to go back to China, part of China's appeal is that at least since 2006, its interest seems to have been very consistent, and its presence has been fairly consistent. So in areas of concern to the Pacific, such as access to US labour markets, such as climate change, there needs to be more listening on the part of US policymakers and US business to what the genuine needs of the Pacific are. Otherwise, you can talk about it being America's backyard or whatever, but if you're not paying attention to your backyard, then why should they care about you?
In what ways is China's influence in the Pacific Islands most apparent?
It really depends which Pacific Islands you're talking about. But if you were to generalize across the whole Pacific, you would say their influence was most apparent in terms of elites. And in many cases, you could refer to it as elite capture, but certainly their influence among the political and economic elites in Pacific countries is much stronger than their influence among ordinary people. Some countries, they have a great deal more influence, and often this comes down to economic factors, like how trade dependent the country is on China, and it varies enormously across the Pacific. So for example, in the Solomon Islands, more than 2/3 of their exports to China. So other than North Korea, they're just about the most dependent on China of any nation on the planet. Then you get to Fiji, which has moved slightly away from China in recent months. And in some ways, that's not a mystery because China doesn't even make the top 4 of their trading partners. Its main export is Fiji water to the US, oddly enough. So thank you, Hollywood, for that.
What makes China an attractive partner for the Pacific Islands?
So in terms of what their attraction is, again, there's a real divide between the elites and the grassroots. So for the elites, I'll tell one story that maybe illustrates it best. This was in Papua New Guinea about 15 years ago. And there was a politician who was keen to get a project up and running with a Chinese partner. So it was a China Exim Bank loan. He already had money from the World Bank to do this project, and yet he switched halfway to take the Exim Bank loan, even though the interest rate was less favourable and it seemed to be not as good a deal overall. And I said, look, why did you go with China? And he didn't hesitate and just turned to me and said, because they're quick. And that was it. It was essentially they're quick, their aid and their support comes with less strings than Western donors. And if you want stuff done, it can happen fast. And for political elites, that's very attractive. Amongst the community, they're not without appeal. And again, there's some overlap there, that they're building things and that they're building things that are visible has a real impact amongst much of the community. Yeah, they have a very love-hate relationship with the Chinese diaspora, but they view the companies that come in as real builders of the country. So when they build stadiums, when they build roads, hospitals, this is really welcomed by the community at large. When they build big government office buildings, not so much. So yeah, there is some parallels, but essentially they're seen as doers and builders and people who do stuff quick and don't talk quite so much as the West.
How do elite and popular opinions of China differ in the Pacific Islands?
Yeah, again, really broad brush, because there is a huge variation across the Pacific in terms of how China is viewed, both amongst elites and amongst the general people. I mean, from the extreme of Palau, where you have a country asking to have a US military base built there, and it seems to be out and out doing everything it can to annoy China, to the Solomon Islands with Sogavari appearing on national TV and declaring that he feels like he's home, or back home, I should say. So huge variation. But within that, the elites, they, I think, appreciate the way the Chinese do business in many ways, at least upfront. And they also really appreciate the red carpet treatment that they get when they go to Beijing. And this is something that doesn't cost China a great deal and that wins it a lot of political capital. And when you look at some of the metropolitan powers who are big in the Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, it is something that they really failed to do. I mean, it's striking that in Australia, for example, we've had the leader of the US address our parliament. We've had Xi Jinping address our parliament. We yet to have a single Pacific leader address our parliament. And that is something that you think could be arranged very easily. We have, you know, statesmen of some stature. We have, for example, Marape in Papua New Guinea. We have leaders such as Rambuka in Fiji who have the gravitas to do a really good oration in the parliament, and yet we don't invite them. For the general community, the concern they have is that Chinese shopkeepers in particular are taking their jobs and are crowding out local businesses. So that would be the main gripe that grassroots have throughout the Pacific. That said, these shops do provide, you know, basic everyday things, and they're really, really cheap. So it's again a love-hate thing. Like they like the convenience of these shops, but they feel as though their jobs are being taken by these Chinese migrants.
Why should Americans pay attention to relations between China and the Pacific Islands?
Look, I think in many ways, even the framing of that question is interesting, because I think America should be paying more attention to the Pacific full stop, regardless of what China is up to. Because what China is doing now in the Pacific, how sustainable it is open to question. No one knows exactly what's going to happen under Xi Jinping's leadership. If they pivot away from the Pacific, does America then ignore the Pacific again? So the case is there to be made that, you know, America should accept the fact that half of its coast is on the Pacific. America certainly should be more integrated to the Pacific. And the problem is that America has various levers it can pull. The military presence has always been very strong. And Indo-PACOM, as it's now called, formerly PACOM, knows the Pacific really well, are deeply engaged and have a great historical memory of the place. But when you go to the business side of things, when you go to the political side of things in the US, engagement is a lot more spotty. Post-Cold War, basically the perception is politically America moved out after Clinton declared that you know, victory was theirs. And on the business side, investment from American companies is very tepid to at best, even though there are lots of opportunities in tourism, in telecommunications, and even in data call centers. You know, the Pacific would be a great place to base call centers out of, because people are really friendly and they're awake at a time that you know, a lot of other people are asleep. So why that sort of investment isn't going in is a bit of a mystery. The Pacific is a little bit high cost. Like it's not a cheap place to live or to invest, but you know, there needs to be a broader engagement, I think, from the US that goes beyond the military.
What can the United States do to be a better partner for the Pacific Islands?
Yeah, so that is something I think you can generalize across. Obviously, the US is much more engaged in the Northern Pacific, the compact states. So these are the Micronesian states in the north of the Pacific that America has economic arrangements with. And for those countries, they are pretty well integrated to the US. You know, they can serve in the US military, they can access American Social Security. So they, in some ways, are very much already part of the American sphere. But even in these countries and in the South Pacific more broadly, what people are looking for in terms of a good partner is someone who is reliable, who shows up year after year and is willing to listen to what the Pacific wants. And the Pacific's development needs and economic needs are real. And there is a feeling, I think, that in the past, US administrations have, moved in and made a lot of promises, and then the administration changes, and then you get a very different sort of thing. So to go back to China, part of China's appeal is that at least since 2006, its interest seems to have been very consistent, and its presence has been fairly consistent. So in areas of concern to the Pacific, such as access to US labor markets, such as climate change, I think there needs to be more listening on the part of US policymakers and US business to what the genuine needs of the Pacific are. Otherwise, you can talk about it being America's backyard or whatever, but if you're not paying attention to your backyard, then why should they care about you?
How can the United States and China cooperate to serve the needs of the Pacific Islands?
So there's so much potential in this area, and the US-China relationship in Chinese foreign policy is the paramount relationship. It is the one that gets the most attention, and the rest of us here in Australia and New Zealand and the Pacific more broadly have to accept that we are peripheral concerns of the Chinese leadership. But there are so many areas of potential cooperation between the US and China, most notably the existential threat of climate change faced by Pacific nations. They are the most vulnerable to natural disasters. Vanuatu is the most vulnerable. Tonga, I think, is number 3. Palau, I think, is about number 4 or number 5 in terms of the impact natural disasters are having on their countries. And since 1970, the frequency of these events has tripled. So, you can't, of course, you can argue that climate change isn't responsible, but it is clear that these disasters are increasing in both frequency and severity. So in terms of doing something about climate change, in terms of cooperating on disaster relief, there is an enormous potential for the US and China to work together. That is one area where both sides seem to be in agreement on, so it's probably the easiest area of cooperation. There used to be deeper cooperation. China and the US even had a trilateral cooperation project in Timor-Leste. They didn't give it a lot of publicity, but this was only 10, 15 years ago. The time for that might not be right now, but it has happened in the past. And so, we should always be attuned to the fact that political realities in China could change, and we should be ready when that happens. But climate change is the most important. We're already at a situation in some Pacific countries where people are having to abandon their villages as a result of rising sea levels, as a result of increasing storm surges. So, the threat is real and is something that, the US and China need to work on together. Is the political climate ready for that yet? I'm not sure. Oddly, China's climate change-related aid in the Pacific has been fairly, not that spectacular. If anything, Japan has been the major player in that area, but there's so much scope for the US and China to work on this together. Another area that doesn't get a lot of attention, but there is a real potential for working together to make both the US and China look more credible in the Pacific, is to address issues of transnational crime and issues of environmental crime that are occurring in the resource sector in the Pacific, in particular in forestry and in fisheries. Tuna is something very much at the focus of many US lawmakers' minds, but the overfishing in the Pacific and the Pacific not getting as big a return on its fisheries is something that both parties, I think, could do a great deal to address. Obviously, in the case of China, you have a problem, along with Taiwan, to be fair, where there is a lot of illegal and unregulated fishing going on. That is something that, in order to be a credible player in the Pacific, the US and China really need to work on this, because much of this crime happens out of the reach of the Chinese state. It's not that people in Beijing want to have a reputation as being irresponsible fishers, but it really damages their reputation in the region when basically fish are caught and not paid for. It's really something that annoys people in this country. And on the other side of the coin, if the US and China could work together on the disposal of munitions, oddly enough, left over from World War II, this is the American legacy that hurts America more than anything else. Flies completely under the radar, but if you spend a bit of time in, say, the Solomon Islands, it comes up pretty quickly. So if this is something they could work on together, that would really be, you know, an incredibly welcome development in the Pacific.
Serbia is a country that wants to become part of the European Union at some point, which will bring Serbia even closer to the US. On the other side, China is perceived as a big brother, maybe, or big sister, whatever we want to call it. It is helping Serbia, but not really asking anything in return.
In what ways is China's influence in Serbia most apparent?
Serbia and China now have a more than decade-long trajectory of developing contemporary relations, and the economic cooperation was the basis for all of the other developments in the partnership that came between two countries. Out of those economic cooperation that was based on the loan agreements for the infrastructure projects, so roads, bridges, railroads, also came the political cooperation, which is now the most evident in the cooperation on the highest level between the ruling political elite in Serbia, led by President Aleksandar Vučić, and the Serbian Progressive Party, the dominant political party and dominant political power in Serbia. If you think about cooperation between Serbia and China, you think about the infrastructural developments that have been facilitated by this cooperation, but you also think about the companies that came from China to Serbia and entered the strategic areas of Serbian economy. On one side, those projects came with some undoubted benefits for Serbia. So because of the close partnership that has been established, more and more Chinese companies started coming in Serbia, enabling more people to get jobs, even preserving some old industrial complexes in mining sector, steel manufacturing. We got some new highways. We also have some bridges, sections for the railroads. But the concerns were also raised whether all of those were done by the book in accordance to the Serbian legislation, Serbian law, in alignment with the environmental standards, but also the treatment of the labor. So yeah, the cooperation can be described as a complex. Politicians are calling it strategic comprehensive. So large words, big terms that are being used to describe these developments, but certainly it is not happening in the limbo. Serbia has other partners as well. Serbia cooperates with different actors, including US. So yeah, a lot of concerns and questions came out of the level of the cooperation between Belgrade and Beijing over the past decade or so.
What makes China an attractive partner for Serbia?
So Serbia is a small country. Serbia is a country of about 6.5 million people living in it. And Serbia is a country in the Western Balkan region. Western Balkan region is a European region, but none of the Western Balkan countries are part of the European Union. It is also a developing country, which means that out of the 1990s and the ruling of the dictator Slobodan Milošević, Serbia went through democratic transition, but also it went through the different phases of economic development. Seeking international partners, Serbia looked both west and east, and although often Russia has been described as a traditional partner for Serbia, in the late first decade of the 21st century, China stepped into the scene. What made China attractive in the first phase of cooperation was actually quite favorable loan agreements, which were really needed for Serbian infrastructural development. Because of the financial crisis that hit the West quite hard, China became a country that was able to provide favorable loan agreements and also to fast track it by pretty much not asking for any conditions in return. Just if you are able to repay them, they will be more than happy to cooperate with you. And then the COVID-19 crisis came and struck the whole world, and China used it to promote itself as a global leader in the fight against COVID. And Serbia was quite accepting for the Chinese efforts in providing, let's say, assistance in fighting on COVID-19 pandemic. But pretty much it can be described in one sentence, like China provided Serbia what Serbia needed. And a lot of that cooperation was demand-driven. And what was quite good for Serbia and but most notably Serbian decision makers is that there was no clear negative consequences in the short term, because you see like the opening of the new factories, you see like the new highways, the railroads, but you don't see what can come down the road. That is like something that is concerning the experts like myself, but to the European future of the Western Balkan region and Serbia, and standards when it comes to the rule of law, when it comes to the environmental protection, something that came second to the imperative of economic development. It didn't matter how you can reach that economic development as long as you reach it in a short term.
How do elite and popular opinions of China differ in Serbia?
We often talk about how China is presenting itself on a global scale, and we often hear different opinions on China trying to become a leader of a developing role. China is trying to position itself as someone who is providing development, someone who is assisting all of those countries in Africa and Latin America, and in the region where I'm coming from, the Western Balkans, reaching the higher level of economic development. And that was also facilitated and used by leaders, political leaders in the countries that are maybe not still on the highest level of democratic development. Again, countries that went either through some type of democratic transition or countries that, for example, are not part of the European Union. That has enabled our political leaders to present China as a beneficial partner for Serbia. And through that promotion coming from our political leaders, China gained a lot of popularity among the ordinary folks. China is a country that Serbia never had open conflict with. China is a country that is not presented as someone who is conditioning Serbia with anything in order to reach some of the milestones of the joint cooperation. And China is someone who is also utilizing the anti-Western narrative that is present in the countries like mine. What I mean when I say anti-Western narrative, well, Serbia has a history of conflict with the NATO alliance. In 1999, NATO had its intervention in Yugoslavia due to the conflict between Serbia and Kosovo at that time. And that still plays a symbolic role when it comes to the feelings and perceptions of the Serbian citizens towards, for example, the United States or the NATO alliance. The other side, China is perceived as a big brother, maybe, or big sister, whatever we want to call it, because it is like helping Serbia, but not really asking anything in return, which is how we are presented with that level of cooperation. But if you dig a little bit more in depth, and if you look a little bit more in details, it's evident that it is not as simple as that. There is still some requirements that Serbia needs to fulfill in order to reach that level of cooperation with China, but still people are seeing China as someone who is a good friend and someone who is helping you and not really conditioning you with anything, or you don't have that bad history of cooperation between those.
Why should Americans pay attention to the China-Serbia relationship?
The most important thing for US when it comes to the Western Balkan region is establishing partnership that will enable safe and stable region. Western Balkans are the region that have a history of conflict. We had our civil war during the 1990s, during the dissolvement of former country of Yugoslavia. We had our Kosovo war in the end of the 20th century. And although we had democratic changes in the beginning of this century, there are still a lot of frozen conflicts or tensions between some of the countries in the Western Balkan region. On the other hand, United States of America have significant presence in the region, either through bilateral cooperation or through cooperation with countries like Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro, in alliance like NATO alliance, for example. But if I have to mention one term that people need to have in mind in realizing how important the US presence in the region is, and that is battling with the risks. If you have a country or a region which is on the very verge, on the very border of European Union, with a significant presence of China and increasing presence in China from year to year, then that means that your rival on the global scale is gaining ground in your immediate neighborhood. To put it like that, for European Union, the Western Balkans are what Cuba, for example, is for United States of America, a region that has like a complicated history, and it has their own way of, establishing their own systems, not always democratic, but when it comes to the security, when it comes to the defense, it is a really important part of the neighborhood for countries, communities like European Union is. So by providing, let's say, a more clear picture of what are the benefits of cooperation with the United States and what are the risks coming from cooperation with China, then United States can gain a little bit more ground in the region and certainly can mitigate some of the malign consequences of the Chinese presence, not only in Serbia, but in the wider Western Balkan region as well.
What can the United States do to be a better partner for Serbia?
United States and Serbia have, let's say, long-standing but complicated history. And for United States, Serbia has been a valuable partner in the past. We were on the same side during the World War II. After 1945, US really helped at that time country of Yugoslavia in reaching a certain type of political system and economic development, which really helped Yugoslavia at that time to stay out of the framework of cooperation of the Soviet Union. But with the change of regime in Yugoslavia at that time and Slobodan Milosevic coming to power, things got a little bit more complicated. And now we had like a couple of decades of intense, back and forth when it comes to the relationship between Belgrade and Washington, but we are now witnessing a new phase of cooperation. United States have become once again really invested in the regional developments, and Serbian and US interests are now aligning when it comes to the stability of the region, peace within the Western Balkan region, and of course economic prosperity. And I would say that US-Serbia relations are currently on a good trajectory with a couple of challenges that are encountering. One of those challenges certainly is the increased presence of China when it comes to the partnership with Serbia. And the reason for the level of partnership that Serbia and China have right now is that at a certain point, Serbia didn't really have the alternative when it comes to the economic development, especially the fast-tracked economic and infrastructural development within the country. China was a really favorable partner because it was able to provide fast what Serbia needed to reach the higher level of economic development. And now China is a little bit ahead when it comes to the economic cooperation, but providing alternative to the Chinese, for example, loans to the infrastructural projects, or investing in Serbia, creating exchanges between students, between politicians, working on the ground with citizens, will certainly further improve the position of the United States in Serbia. On the other hand, Serbia can be that valuable partner in establishing a peaceful and stable region, because in the end, Serbia is a country that wants to become part of the European Union at some point, which would, bring Serbia even closer to the US. But while that happens, and while we are still in that process of joining the European Union, having strong presence of important partners of US, and not only to be there, but also to be visible, to be present in the everyday conversations, is the way how Serbia and US can strengthen their relation and therefore mitigate the existing presence of China in the economic cooperation, political cooperation, but in the wider society as well.
How can the United States and China cooperate to serve the needs of Serbia?
The role of United States and the role of China in Serbia can be best described as a parallel tracks. Currently, Serbia has established a relationship with both countries and trying to get the best of both of them. And while in the current status quo, that is something that is still a possibility, certainly the impact that it will have on Serbia will mostly depend on the global developments of the US-China partnership, US-China rivalry, depending on how we look at the perspective of current state of relations between those two countries. Serbia, as a small country, will be a country that needs a dedicated partnership from reliable partners. And United States can be that reliable partner for Serbia. On the other hand, China has already become that in certain way. So when you are a small country, you feel the consequences of the global developments as well. And while so far those consequences and results of cooperation with both US and China have been positive ones, Serbia will actually have those parallel tracks to pick a side at some point, because we cannot stay out of the global affairs, we cannot stay out of the global development. So to finish with one message for both US viewers and the people from other parts of the world, look at Serbia as a potential, look at Serbia as a country that can be a reliable partner of the European Union, that can be a valuable part of the European Union, and it can be a dedicated partner of the United States. And try to provide alternatives to the other influences that are existing in the country, try to build on the positive aspects of the existing relationship between US and Serbia, and again, try to look at Serbia as a friend and not as an enemy.
China is attractive in the sense that it is seen as a great power which behaves like truly equal power to us. China has built a very solid brand of what it stands for, big brother, south to south cooperation, and it's worked.
In what ways is China's influence in Kenya most apparent?
I would say in two ways. The most important is debt. So over the last decade, Kenya has accumulated about 10 billion US dollars of debt. Out of that, 65 to 70% of that debt is from China. So over the years, Kenya has realized that debt is becoming a problem. And when we had our last election, which brought in a new president, there was a realization that this huge dependency on debt, and debt from China specifically, needs to change. So one of the big areas in which China has influenced us is because of the huge amounts of debt from China. There has been a very good discussion about where should we be borrowing the money from. In that sense, there's a shift towards more domestic borrowing, at least a wish for more domestic borrowing, even if that's not happening very well. There has been a question of why we went so much into a bilateral debt without some kind of balancing. So that is being corrected by sort of expanding our bilateral sources of debt. And thirdly, in a negative way, of course, the debt has meant that we've now increased a lot of taxation on Kenyans. So Kenyans now can draw a direct link between domestic policy and international policy. So debt has been huge. And out of that debt, a huge part of what Kenya collects, about a third of Kenya's collections, go to repaying of Chinese debt. So that is one of the big ones, debt, and what the effect of that debt is domestically. The other one I would say is imports, which is broadly an African issue where most countries in Africa, Kenya imports 25% of its import from China. So it's risen very stealthily to a very high level. So China is our biggest import market. And by far, the second one is much smaller, which is India. The impact of imports is interesting because it's really not matched by how much we export to China. So we are absolutely very reliant on China and on very key products. So in that way, China has a lot of leverage on Kenya as an importer. And unlike the United States, which actually we do now have a trade balance with, I think we export slightly more to the US than the US exports to Kenya. We have a huge trade imbalance with China. So in summary, I would say the two things is debt and trade, and unfavorable trade that Kenya has with China.
What makes China an attractive partner for Kenya?
China has built a very solid brand of what it stands for. So it's this sort of apolitical, big brother, south to south cooperation, that kind of brand. And it's been a very persuasive brand, and it's worked. So China is attractive in the sense that it is seen as a great power which behaves like truly equal power to us. Kenya does understand the inequality, how powerful China is, but China is very attractive because of its approach, this apolitical approach. That apolitical approach is what has made China very attractive as a source of capital, so a source of loans, partly because it's not seen as, and this is important, it's not seen as intrusive in terms of its oversight as the United States. Does that mean that its loans are not indeed probably as bad? No, so it's got other issues. Let's say there are other challenges or other issues with its loans, but at least it's built a very good brand of being apolitical, and that being apolitical cuts across, even commercial activities. If it's arms imports, for example, you realize Kenya, like many other African countries, has been increasing its military equipment procurement from China, and that has to do with this idea of China as a non-intrusive, limited or no oversight over how that is used and so on. So that contrasts, of course, very starkly with the approach of the United States, which is seen as overly intrusive, overly oversight-oriented, and so a bit patronizing. So that contrasts very broadly the difference in the two countries' approaches, and I think it's an important challenge for the United States, particularly in how do they rebrand their sort of big brother brand.
How do elite and popular opinions of China differ in Kenya?
I don't know if they actually differ. I think roundly there's a very positive feeling about China. And why I say they don't differ much is because when you look at, for example, what I talked about earlier, the commercial element of China-Kenya relations, a lot of it is driven by ordinary business people. So if you categorize those as non-elite sort of business class people, the view of China is a very positive one. So if you're thinking clothes, if you're thinking machinery, if you're thinking any sorts of products, the first place they're thinking of is China. So there's a huge understanding of China really as a commercial port where when you go to China, you cannot fail to get anything. So the soft power aspects of China's attractiveness, of course, is very much commercial, but it's there and it's pretty good. And then, of course, at the political level, there's also a very good feeling about China. One is because there's an acceptance of an inevitability about China's rise as a great power, probably the most dominant power in the coming 25 years. So even among the political elite, the top political elite, there's acceptance that China is a country that you can't ignore. You have to pay attention to it, and it offers immense opportunities across board in terms of financing, as we've been doing, but also in terms of technology transfers, in terms of student exchanges, in terms of it seems ready also to come up with solutions and listen. I don't think the two differ much, the elite and sort of the business ordinary person's view. The only maybe little negative I would say is it's got a problem. It's become so dominant, that commercially dominant, that presents a problem for the ordinary people. So we had a case a few months back where we got a mall called China Square, which is this shop owned by Chinese, which is selling everything, and it's so cheap. And there was a huge national outcry about why they got a license to operate in Nairobi and sell things so cheaply, and in so doing outsell the ordinary person. So I think that is mostly the downside, ordinary person's view of China as this sort of very competitive and dominant player who might come to take away people's jobs and people's livelihood. But otherwise, that was resolved. It's not there in the conversation anymore. So I think loudly quite positive views of China.
Why should Americans pay attention to the China-Kenya relationship?
So I think broadly, the US should really care because China, in some cases, represents a very different vision particularly for global values and global multilateral governance, different from what the US presents. And increasingly, that governance style is one which is more about stability, let's say, than pure democracy. And the question is, how well is that catching on among different African countries? So I think it's something that challenges the US view of their role in democratic enhancements, and therefore Chinese entry into countries such as Kenya, and particularly the involvement of the Chinese Communist Party itself, is something that is increasing, and therefore something that needs at least to be, well, not checked, but monitored in what is the overall vision and what are they thinking, and particularly from the Kenyan side. But I would say that there's a lot of interest from the Kenyan side and a willingness to want to study that model and what China really presents at a global level.
What can the United States do to be a better partner for Kenya?
I think it needs to think seriously about the brand that it presents. So part of the reason why I think China is quite successful is that China has been quite consistent in the brand of diplomacy that it offers or presents and approaches. The US swings a lot, and it's not, of course, it's because of the democratic situation in the US and the presidential elections and changes. So every president brings their own vision. But I think consistency is what would win Kenyans to the US side. We need to understand what the US really stands for. One of the areas that I think the US can really be effective, which is also in line with their vision, is really to help the ordinary Kenyans stamp and stem the wave of corruption and degradation of governance at the point of stealing of public resources. All the money transfers, all the sort of profit shifting, if it's corporations, if the US is seen as serious in actually countering, particularly at the political level, countering corruption, I think it can restore a lot of confidence in what the US stands for. And it's something that it's been doing with many other countries, Nigeria and so on. But I think it's at a very small scale that people really don't see the seriousness. So if you really hit hard and caught some big fish who are involved in some not so straight money transfers and business and things like that, that can be effective. Otherwise, I think the US should just stay focused and remain on what they have traditionally done, which is governance, democracy, health. I think they have done really well in health. I think it's a great area that the US is recognized as a leader and really important. Only that in governance, I think the focus needs to be a little bit just beyond the elections. I think it needs to go to aspects of delivery. So what do democratic leaders actually deliver? And that's part of the anti-corruption drive and so on. So if that was to be delivered, I think the US would come out as a very credible influencer in the country and therefore actually win a lot of at least public support for the interventions.
How can the United States and China cooperate to serve the needs of Kenya?
I think it's first, of course, to understand Kenya's interest and see where they can agree on common areas of alignment in the three countries, so US, Kenya, and China. And I think it's not difficult. One of those areas is stability in Kenya and Kenya's regional objectives. So things like fighting terrorism, things like becoming an exporter of peace around the East African region and the Horn of Africa. Kenya wants to be stable, and Kenya doesn't want to be destabilized by the conflicts in the neighboring countries. I think Ethiopia is a bit of a concern. South Sudan, Somalia. So that should not be an area of competition, in my view. I think it's possible for the great powers to align with Kenya to help Kenya bring stability, export peace in these regions. I think one other area would be good actually to have committees at different levels. So, for example, parliamentary committees on US, China, Kenya partnerships. So the point of these kind of committees at a political level would be to engage on what are the issues of common benefit, to monitor their progress, and to highlight those issues. And actually, I think it's really important to highlight that there are many areas of common interest, and partly, maybe particularly among us scholars, we tend to see this as mostly a conflict issue. I mean, a great power competition issue. There is great power competition, but I think there are many aspects of alignment in terms of interests, things like stability, everybody. I mean, I think we all want stability in East Africa. And Kenya has been the hub for that. I think it's important if we approached the Kenya developmental issues from a point of trade balance. I think it's possible to work together to ensure that the two countries, US and China, actually work on that and improve that. So the US is there already. And therefore, I think even though there might be competition for commercial advantages, it's possible also to work it from the Kenyan perspective, which is we would like to increase our exports to the two countries in a way that is proportionate with what you sell to us. I think that is a proposition that can be worked on. And I think this is where China isn't doing enough, in my view. I think they haven't really done much in terms of any kind of preferential investment or trade agreements with Kenya. And I think this could be some of the areas for partnership to ensure that basically the idea here would be developmental. So the best way to develop the country would be through trade. And I think this is something that can be worked on.
There were very high expectations towards what China was able to offer. They did not really translate into tangible results on the ground.
In what ways is China's influence in Poland most apparent?
To put it very simply, I think that there are at least 3 dimensions of China's influence in Poland: political, economic, and people to people. And the economic dimension, I think, is the one that usually, appears quite high in the media, on the headlines. And it's about, on the one hand, the willingness of the Polish consecutive governments to attract Chinese investment and to perceive China as a very attractive economic partner. But also it's about China being quite proactive in the past decade, trying to attract Poland, but also other Central and Eastern European countries to join Beijing-led initiatives such as the 16+1 platform, which is not very active anymore, but it used to be perceived as China's so-called Trojan horse of European unity. So for many years, China has been trying to portray itself as an alternative to Western European partners, an economic source of foreign investment, but also in the political dimension, which is maybe a little bit less evident than the economic dimension of influence. China has been very skillful in trying to portray itself as this neutral actor, a country that is only interested in very quote unquote pragmatic cooperation without that many political strings attached. And this narrative, it used to be quite attractive to many among political elites in Poland, with a belief that, especially in the context of the post-2008 financial crisis, Beijing could somehow step in and, on the one hand, bring investment, but also become this alternative pole of attraction to leaders that have become increasingly populist, but also, in some cases, nationalist. It's quite similar to what happened in Hungary, with Viktor Orban also becoming very populist and seeing China as an alternative to Western European countries, or to a certain extent, even the US. So that's the political dimension of Chinese influence. But last but not least, there is the people-to-people cooperation. And that's about many different initiatives funded by Beijing, including cooperation between universities, for example, Confucius Institutes, but also a lot of scholarship programs, media cooperation between different civil society organizations, and overall these attempts to try to reach out to the public, to soften China's image and to portray China as, a benevolent actor that is not really willing to interfere in local politics. But of course, the underlying interests were different, and they were very explicitly political. But in terms of the soft power outreach, China's growing footprint in Poland has been portrayed for many years as very benign and not really aiming to influence the local debate or sideline certain voices, or maybe amplify those which were more pro-Beijing in the local debate, to shape the whole discourse on China-Poland relations.
What makes China an attractive partner for Poland?
I think that we should differentiate between what China was to Poland a decade ago and what it is now, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine. Because the war in Ukraine was a game changer, and it continues to be a game-changing event for Polish security, but also the security of Europe as a whole. And China's involvement, you could say the tacit approval for the war and continued economic and diplomatic support for Russia, this behavior has heavily influenced the way Polish political elites, but also the broader public sees China. 10 years ago, I think there was a lot of naivety regarding Chinese offer. There were very high expectations towards what China was able to offer in terms of investment. Belt and Road Initiative was received very warmly. Poland and China also signed firstly, as early as in 2011, strategic cooperation agreement. And then this was elevated to comprehensive strategic partnership in 2016 when Xi Jinping visited Poland. But the fact that these political signs of optimism were out there, they did not really translate into tangible results on the ground. And at the same time, the international environment changed with Donald Trump being elected as the US president, and then the Sino-American rivalry accelerating. But also the pandemic was yet another element kind of influencing local Polish political elites to reconsider the role of China as an allegedly neutral actor or responsible player. So that is also why I think we could turn this question around and ask why China is not an attractive partner to Poland anymore. It's been a long journey of realizing that many of the assumptions about cooperation with China, they might not have been true from the very beginning. So China was not really ready to invest in Poland as much as the local elites might have wanted to. But also China was not very knowledgeable when it comes to the local context. China was not very conscious about the implications of, for example, very difficult history between Russia and Poland and how it now affects Poland's considerations and Poland's assessment of China's approval for the war in Ukraine, de facto approval of the war in Ukraine. So all these elements point towards a very deep rethink going on in Poland regarding the attractiveness of China as a partner. And definitely there are still people who believe that economic cooperation is a must, and we're not talking about decoupling. Yes, there are some discussions about de-risking in line with, a trend that is all over Europe. But I think that there's just much less political appetite for truly strategic cooperation with China because there is a mismatch in long-term strategic interests between Beijing and Warsaw, especially regarding cooperation with Russia, between China and Russia, and then how Poland sees it as a threat to its own interests and its own security via the war in Ukraine.
How do elite and popular opinions of China differ in Poland?
I think that if you look at the general public, there is a lot of simplistic opinions about China, and people are not that much interested in understanding the way China operates or what kind of interest it has. I'm afraid that quite unfortunately, China is still seen as a faraway country that does not have a real impact on the ground in Poland. But I think that if you look at the data, and we have access to some data, for example, some recent surveys, they all suggest that overall people are becoming much more skeptical towards Beijing. And that's not only about Beijing's politics, but it's also related to the way people started to look at China during the pandemic. But if you look at the political elites, I think that in the context of the war in Ukraine and how China has been very consistent in endorsing Russian talking points and the Russian perspective and legitimizing it on the international arena, it has also translated into growing skepticism among political elites, both on the left and on the right. And currently, the only political force that is openly talking about the importance of returning to business as usual in cooperation with China is the alt-right, the far right, and people who are also visibly pro-Russian in some cases. And this is, a political force that is not very popular in Poland. It's on the margins. Potentially, China could become a part of the electoral debate in Poland, but it hasn't.
Why should Americans pay attention to the China-Poland relationship?
If you consider Poland as a country that has been very much at the forefront of supporting Ukraine, and then you look at the way the political debate in some circles in the US has been also developing, with the argument being that, Washington cannot support NATO's eastern flank without an end, because sooner or later, more focus must be shifted to the Indo-Pacific. This kind of arguments, they don't really gain a lot of sympathy in Poland, as you can imagine. So in the context of what's going on in the American political debate, and then security-wise on NATO's eastern flank and on the Indo-Pacific with Taiwan, or the general kind of rise of tensions on the Indo-Pacific, I think it's crucial for the public in America to understand that a choice between NATO's eastern flank and the Indo-Pacific is kind of a false choice. So if the US does not support Ukraine and focuses only on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific, we will probably end up in a situation with Russia being more emboldened to test the strength of Europe. And Poland is playing quite a crucial part in this regard. So I think that Poland-China relations at this point, because of the importance of the war in Ukraine, have undergone a huge evolution. And because of that, I think Polish political elites are not naive anymore about China. But at the same time, I think that there's a growing awareness of the fact that the theaters of war on the Indo-Pacific and in Eastern Europe are kind of merging. And that's something that I think it's not really seen in the public debate, and it hasn't yet trickled down to the debate that is outside of the expert circles. And that's something that's important to remember, that, you know, it's not only about America looking at Poland-China relations, but also about Poland looking at how the US security policy is shifting towards the Indo-Pacific and what kind of implications this can have for Europe, not only for Poland, but for Europe as a whole, for the EU and its security.
What can the United States do to be a better partner for Poland?
So it's about being able to conceptualize supporting both NATO's eastern flank and American allies on the Indo-Pacific at the same time, because, you know, we live in a super interconnected world where decisions on the one side of Europe will also have effects on the resilience of places such as Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and on the credibility of the US. So I think that Washington has a lot of support among Polish political elites. People here are very much aware that the US is the only security guarantor for Poland in the current situation. But also there is a growing fear that because of the whole shift towards the Indo-Pacific and the upcoming elections in the US, the cost and benefit calculation in Washington might shift, and this could also be quite a problem for Polish security, but also European security.
How can the United States and China cooperate to serve the needs of Poland?
With the current level of tensions between the US and China, to talk about cooperation between the US and China to help Poland in any regard, it's a little bit detached from reality. We still have a couple of areas where cooperation between China and the US is possible, for example, climate change, but also we have to bear in mind that climate change as such should be problematized in the context of the Chinese long-term goals and interests. So yes, fighting climate change without China is impossible, but each country that is preparing or rolling out certain environmental policies is doing so also because of its own very specific national interest. And for China, you know, it can be the so-called beautiful China strategy. It can be about actually working towards strengthening China's comparative advantages in certain technologies that will, on the one hand, help fight climate change, but on the other hand, it will also strengthen China's industrial capabilities. So it's not black and white. And for Poland, security is the most crucial thing. We have a war in Europe on our continent, and given how existential the threat is for us, we have to focus on the immediate effects and the immediate needs of Poland and other countries in this regard. China-Russia ties at this point are strategically close. There needs to be an understanding among the public that China has been legitimizing Russian talking points and Russian perspective on the war. The US support and the US long-term ability to be a credible partner on NATO's eastern flank is crucial. So I think it's also about having some kind of lines of communication with China regarding the war and being very clear about the red lines in this regard. But also it's about not being very naive when it comes to the ability of Western leaders to actually pull China away from Russia, because I think that there are actually more things that bind them together rather than pull them apart.
China's influence in Nepal becomes apparent on the more geopolitical front, and that is also quite often reduced to rhetoric.
In what ways is China's influence in Nepal most apparent?
Instead of influence, I find the term presence more fitting because the term influence sound rhetorical, not espousing the pragmatic reality of Nepal-China ties. Actually, Beijing's presence in Nepal is visible in the high-level visits of the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, China's aids and assistance that have been doled out to Nepal, or even railway pledges and BRI implementation projects. While the language, foods, or culture, religion, and lifestyle between Nepal and China, they differs extensively, and people from both countries are yet to know and explore more about each other. So against such a backdrop, Nepali power mongers and Chinese power elites, they have managed to signal the West that relations between Kathmandu and Beijing have flourished. As such, I should say, China's influence in Nepal becomes apparent on the more geopolitical front, and that is also quite often reduced to rhetoric.
What makes China an attractive partner for Nepal?
Nepal's location between China on its north and India on its south, and more specifically, I should say, its landlocked status is often presented as a curse by Nepali policymakers, historically speaking. But still, personally, I believe that landlocked countries have their one strength, their one beauty, and still in the name of trade diversification and reciprocity, Nepal agrees with China to bring down the mountains that have separated the people of the two countries for centuries. While Beijing considers Nepal as a strategic gateway to inter-South Asia, Nepal finds pleasure in getting connected with a few seaports and dry ports of China, but that is also limited to discourses and rhetoric. Amidst the dearth of required connectivity infrastructure, Nepal has not been able to materialize the transit facilities that have been offered by Beijing in different agreements. Let me give you an apt example. I should say, like after 2015 blockade on Nepal, Kathmandu inched closer to Beijing with an objective to downsize Nepal's dependency on the south. But it has not happened. As such, it seems that Nepal deems China more strategically as a key player in balancing the interest and involvement of India in Nepal. So in that sense, more than drawing an economic advantage from China, policymakers in Kathmandu have relied on the strategic components of the bilateral ties with Beijing.
How do elite and popular opinions of China differ in Nepal?
Historically, elite narrative about China has been of rescuer here in Nepal, although Beijing has never proved that practically, even in the historical context. Even in 2015, when Nepal faced the blockade, China sent its petroleum products to Nepal, but didn't sell them. I believe that gestured the presence of rhetoric in Beijing's approach to Nepal. And the same narrative of rescuer, or let's say balancer, has been disseminated in the public domain by different governments and different regimes in Nepal. Although few cases of border problems between Nepal and China emerged during pandemic in the Himalayan belt of Nepal, the elite narrative dismissed them instantly. So any account of, let's say, events or experiences and details in the public domain is either informed by the media or the government. For instance, the narrative on BRI and debt trap. So Kathmandu-based policy analysts, they have managed to create the narrative that BRI is advantageous to landlocked country in blustering letters connectivity or growth. And also regarding the debt trap, they managed to politically socialize the public by stating that the component of the Chinese loan to Nepal is unalarming. So in that sense, the way elite narrative about China has been disseminated to the public, that is more interesting, I should say.
Why do you think Americans should pay attention to the China-Nepal relationship?
This is a really pertinent question, because Nepal has perceived its, gigantic neighborhood either as a threat or an opportunity. Nepal's relation with China should be understood along the same line, because Nepal-China ties evolve in three ways. Firstly, as the matter of political, economic, and strategic test of the Chinese leaders, particularly those Chinese leaders in the Standing Committee of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China regarding China's South Asia policy, I should say. And secondly, Nepal's unflinching commitment to One China policy and the mobility of Tibetan refugees. Thirdly, while Nepal-China relations are always informed by the interest of the leaders of the two states, people's interests have been sidelined. So still paying attention to such a relationship may offer United States a perspective to understand how, despite the cultural, religious, linguistic, and other differences existing between the two countries, the geography and the idea of neighborhood are popularized by Chinese power elites and Nepali power mongers.
What can the United States do to be a better partner for Nepal?
I think United States has always stood as a good development partner for Nepal. Thousands of Nepalese are living in the United States. Nepal receives aids, grants, assistance and support from the United States annually. Despite the friendly relations existing between the two countries, the strategic differences between Nepal's two immediate neighbors have made the United States perceive Nepal either from the eyes of the policymaker in Delhi or understanding Nepal's ties with Beijing as a compromise of US interest in Nepal. Thus, it would be apt if US policymakers could kindly perceive Nepal's foreign policy choices and, let's say, diplomatic engagements by understanding the economic, demographic, and even strategic sides of the colossal geography that Nepal is obliged to live with. And it may evolve US-Nepal ties even in a more pleasant manner.
How can the United States and China cooperate to serve the needs of Nepal?
Apprehending the global and regional power dynamics existing today, the US-China cooperation in Nepal seems unattainable, at least at present. Nevertheless, if there arrives a time and opportunity to build cooperation in Nepal, they should start by, I think, adjusting their perception about each other in Nepal. For instance, the understanding of the United States of BRI and China's, comprehension of US, sponsored MCC project in Nepal that triggered numerous controversies and debates in Nepal, which happened to shape and influence the bilateral ties accordingly. So once the Kathmandu-based policymakers or foreign policy analysts, even media, and also the public opinion makers, if they are able to inform and educate both, I should say, the visiting US officials and diplomats, and of course the Chinese party leaders and ambassadors about the fundamentals of Nepal-US ties and Nepal-China ties respectively. So without generating a sense of doubts and suspicion, in that sense, only Kathmandu may remain in a position to get benefited by the cooperation between US and China and Nepal, or at times even drive the cooperation between US and China and Nepal. So despite the possibility of cooperation in the areas of climate change, let's say, trade, connectivity, or counterterrorism, the environment is not ripened, I should say, at the moment. Most importantly, Nepali leaders and diplomats, they are not prepared owing to the budgetary concern of the Nepali foreign policy institutions and their negotiation skills. Historically, Nepali leaders have always learned to either cope with or exploit the great power politics instead of developing diplomatic efficacy to manage it, I should say.
Italy is ready to accept a strategy of de-risking, taking steps to avoid that the relationship with China enables Beijing to exercise coercion against Rome. the transatlantic relationship is still the core of the current liberal international order, Italy would probably be less on board with a sharper, more intense, all-out new Cold War.
In what ways is China's influence in Italy most apparent?
Surely it is primarily a trade relationship. China is the second source of import for Italy. The first one is Germany, but it also is a very asymmetrical relationship. China is only the 10th partner for Italy when it comes to export. Therefore, is it primarily an economic issue and a trade issue. It has become also a political influence later on, especially after the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding in the Belt and Road Initiative in 2019. And therefore, at that moment, it became a much more contested relationship politically, and then it turned into a major also issue of contention with traditional allies of Italy, primarily the United States and the European Union, that largely warned Italy that the Memorandum of Understanding needed to be considered a political agreement, not just an economic agreement. In fact, the memorandum at the time was presented by the government as primarily an economic issue, while it's been considered both by China and by Italy's partners as something with an important political content.
What makes China an attractive partner for Italy?
Well, it's considered very attractive for a number of reasons. First and foremost is something like an unfulfilled economic promise. For many, China is an unexplored market. So many in the business community and sometimes also in the political community would consider China as a partner that could really help Italy boosting its economic growth, especially when it comes to exports. So there is this idea that the Chinese market could potentially really lift the economic fortunes of the country. In a certain extent, there is a will to imitate Germany and France that are exporting much more than we do manufacturing products to China. So there is this idea of looking for new market and therefore largely not underlining the differences when it comes to values and political regime, but really trying to side more on the economic side. But also the perception of China varies a lot according to domestic politics that in Italy changes quite rapidly, and of course also according to the wider international context. But especially when we go back to that particularly important moment, that is 2018, 2019. So at the time, Italy had a government led by a populist coalition formed by the Five Star Movement, a populist movement, and the League, which is a right-wing populist party. And they saw a new and more intense relationship with China, not because there was a particularly deep understanding of the future trajectory of China or an alternative understanding of Italian foreign policy, but because they wanted an alternative. They wanted an alternative to the traditional pillars of Italian foreign policy that are what we call here Atlanticism, so a relationship with the United States, and Europeanism, so the relationship with European partners in the European Union. And therefore, China became a sort of possible avenue that particularly the Five Star Movement looked to find an autonomous, more autonomous foreign policy and a source of trade and growth. The League, on the contrary, looked primarily at Moscow. But it was really a domestic development, was not a different understanding of a role of Italy in the bilateral relationship with China. And therefore, the mood changed quite rapidly when that government and that coalition fell off. We had another government with the Five Star Movement and the center-left party, the Democratic Party. And then we had a grand coalition led by Mario Draghi, former chairman of the European Central Bank, known to be Europeanist and Atlanticist. So with Draghi, we returned to a more mainstream orthodox foreign policy that entailed an entirely different relationship with China. So a lot of this is an outcome of domestic politics, but also, of course, the reality outside have changed, starting from the Trump administration with the trade war and the emergence of the great power competition between the United States and China. Italy is returning to a more traditional approach, but also is embracing a foreign policy that considers de-risking a concept that comes entirely from the European Commission, the European Union. So we are starting to implement that approach. It's not still clear what it means, but surely the approach is very different compared to 5 years ago, for instance.
How do elite and popular opinions of China differ in Italy?
But the perception is quite different. At a popular level, the perception of China has always been mixed and more negative compared to other European countries. Italy is a country that has been for quite some time in relative economic decline, especially when it comes to export and manufacturing. So many Italians would partially blame China for economic competition that often has been considered unfair, but surely they associate the relative decline of our manufacturing industry not just with globalization, not just with maybe the lack of reforms in Italy, but with unfair competition by China. Lately, the other important element at the popular level has been the pandemic. The first phase, when Italy was hit very badly by the pandemic, there was a sign of solidarity on the Chinese side with the fact that they sent aid and medical equipment. So in the first moment, there was a positive impact for sure. In the longer run, the Italian people started to see that the zero COVID approach in China was particularly harsh and not particularly effective. They saw the aid provided in the first phase as something that was instrumental and used to gain a leverage on Italy. And also the pandemic in general affected the Italian image of China that severely deteriorated. Of course, this was in the same period in which China resorted to economic coercion against other partners, was the moment of the repression of Hong Kong. So in general, in the last years, the perception deteriorated quite sharply. The difference with the elite is quite important, however, because decision makers, business leaders would underline much more geopolitical factors. So the emergence of the great power competition with the United States is surely an important factor. The fact that from Brussels, but especially from Washington, we have a clear message of seeking an alignment when it comes to a China policy, of not trusting a strict relationship with China, because this can entail forms of coercion, can entail risks, can entail dependence, and therefore Italian elites are much more sensible to sort of messages and suggestions that will come from Washington and Brussels.
Why should Americans pay attention to the China-Italy relationship?
Well, I think Italy is still a valuable partner in terms of values, in terms of shared interest. Italy is a main partner of the European Union, and the transatlantic relationship remains still, together with other partnership with like-minded partners and democracies in Asia, but the transatlantic relationship is still the core of the current liberal international order. Therefore, it's important to maintain a strong and deep relationship with Italy. There are, of course, also economic reasons. Italy is still an economic power in Europe. Italy is at the core of the Mediterranean, and this is important economically, logistically, militarily in a certain way as well. Italy is a very active NATO partner, something that Rome has demonstrated throughout the entire war on terror, for instance. So there are many reasons why Italy as a middle power is important for the United States, and therefore is important to have frank conversations and deep relations when it comes to every important dossier in the world, when it comes to China, but also when it comes to other important relationships like Italy's role in the Middle East, what we call the wider Mediterranean, but also, of course, Italy's contribution, for instance, to the Ukraine war effort against the Russian invasion. This government, as well as Draghi government, decided to contribute economically and sending military aid to Ukraine, something that I think is very important and something that really helped solidifying the relationship with Washington.
What can the United States do to be a better partner for Italy?
Italy is ready to accept a strategy of de-risking, so taking steps to avoid that the relationship with China turns into something that enables Beijing to exercise coercion against Rome, Italy would probably be less on board with a sharper, more intense, all-out new Cold War. That would create problems because Italy, in general, the business community, the government, are not ready to give up entirely economic engagement with China. That, again, is the second partner economically when it comes to import, and therefore will be a problem to entirely give up an economic relationship with China. But again, everyone in the West, I think, is trying to grapple with what the risking is and what the risking means. We know it's not entirely decoupling, but we are trying to understand what is strategic, what is essential, and what is not. What kind of economic relationship is suitable for a Western democracy to have with China? What should be protected and what can be allowed to market dynamics? So, for instance, Italy has used quite a lot of control when it comes to foreign direct investments. We have something called Golden Power rule that enables the Prime Minister to unilaterally block foreign direct investments. It has been used only for Chinese investments. So, for instance, there's a lot of discussion about how to use this new power. It has been used to block the purchase, for instance, of a firm that produces drones. It has used to block another investment that was aimed to purchase a firm that produces luxury yachts. Okay, not directly related to the military, but still some potentially dual-use technology. It has been used also to block the expansion of the ownership of the Pirelli Group. Pirelli Group produces mostly tires. So again, not necessarily military, but maybe dual use. But again, this says that there is a lot of political discussion on what is allowed, what the risking means. I think it's something that still the US government has to grapple with, the European Commission has to grapple with, other Western partners have to sort of assess what are the boundaries and how those boundaries can evolve, and how the Chinese reactions then would stimulate a further discussion and an evolution of this strategy. So I think that is the main issue, avoiding an all-out competition that would seriously damage the economic and somehow political interest of the country. But I think the country is quite ready to sort of rethink the strategy in the direction of de-risking.
How can the United States and China cooperate to serve the needs of Italy?
Again, in this case, probably we have to talk to limits to the competition rather than direct cooperation. Even if areas of direct cooperation can exist, and especially then if we talk about global public goods. Of course, Italy, as every other country in the world, would benefit of policies directed to contrast climate change. And you cannot have an effective climate governance without both China and the United States. Prevention of pandemic is another. Again, we can make a long list of global public goods. But if we zoom in to the more narrow interest of Italy and the European Union to a certain extent, I would say that limiting the great power competition will be beneficial for Italy, because Italy benefits from open markets. Italy benefits from a stable liberal international order. Italy benefits, for instance, for a working WTO. And therefore, these are entirely issues that the country deeply cares about and aims at promoting a stable and open environment. I think another important issue and more strategic issue regards the relationship with Russia. So for us, being in Europe, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is geographically quite close. So we are ready, of course, to support the Ukraine effort. But there is an issue related to China and Russia. From the American point of view, probably makes sense to sort of lump together China and Russia and try to compete with both. And therefore, it's not that important if China and Russia are sort of pushed on the same side, because there is a strategy of de-risking and competition with China, and there is a strategy, of course, of trying to contrast the expansionism of Russia. From the European point of view, however, it makes sense to try to provide some carrot to China in order to avoid a situation in which China would completely side with Russia and support Russia even more clearly and more substantially with weapons and economic aid. Therefore, I think that this is not perhaps in the front page in Italy, but a bit more at the European level, especially if you go to see Macron's visit to Beijing, in a certain way, Germany's relations with Beijing. So there is an idea, maybe it's naive, but I think it makes somehow sense to provide Beijing with some sort of economic carrot and say, if you don't align yourself with Moscow completely, you still have an open door in Europe, something you don't have in Washington at the moment. But from the European point of view, we don't want to see a Sino-Russian axis. So we try to provide some sort of, again, positive incentive to Beijing to try to prevent them from going all in with Russia. Maybe it's naive, but it is a strategy that I think has been articulated in different capitals in Europe. And is not something that is seen positively in the United States. Macron has been heavily criticized for the visit, maybe for the style as well. Of course, Macron is French, and then he has a particularly Gaullist view of the world in which France needs to be independent from the United States. But in general, from the European perspective, it makes sense to try to do something to separate them rather than push them together, confronting both of them at the same time. So I think this is an issue that should be discussed more between Europeans and Americans, because it's also a geographical perspective and a power difference. So, of course, the United States are looking at Russia as an urgent, immediate challenge, but the long-term challenge to the American position in the world and the liberal international order is definitely China, not Russia. For us, China is somehow geographically far, and therefore we look at Russia as a more urgent threat. But again, this difference leads to probably different perceptions of the relationship between the two, and therefore slightly different strategies when it comes to dealing with Russia and China.
The battlefield in terms of US-China competition is going to be Southeast Asia. Please don't pressure us to take sides. It was a huge disappointment when the United States did not rectify the TPP. The United States need to present a more robust economic choice for the region so the region doesn't over-rely on one country, which is China.
In what ways is China's influence in Southeast Asia most apparent?
Well, to answer your first question about Chinese influence in Southeast Asia, I think probably trade is the most visible sign of Chinese influence. China is ASEAN's largest trading partner, and then since 2020, ASEAN replaced the EU as China's largest trading partner. And that relationship has deepened and is continuing to deepen. Digital trade is a big part of this story. Alibaba has a huge presence in this region. So you can imagine that the impetus provided by COVID actually drove this digital trade to deal with this global supply chain disruptions. So that's one sign of Chinese influence in this region. And the other one is, of course, the BRI. There are many projects of the BRI in Southeast Asia. And this is natural because we are the closest region to China. And there are some cultural similarities which make it easier for Chinese companies, relatively easier to function in this part of the world. Now, the other sign of Chinese influence in this part of the world is when you see countries increasingly taking into account Chinese preferences and interests when they make certain decisions. I mean, we have heard of some meetings, ASEAN meetings, where even if China is not present, countries will think, oh, maybe we shouldn't say this, maybe we shouldn't do that because the Chinese are not going to like it. So, I mean, I consider these are the three key signs that Chinese influence in this part of the world.
Yeah, that's awesome. Are there one or two BRI projects that come to mind when you think of either the most significant, the biggest, the most ambitious, the most influential?
in this region.
In the region.
Can I bring my book down?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a bit of self-advertisement. This book it's called Rivers of Iron, and I've written this with two other professors, one from the United States, the other from Malaysia. So this is actually, I would consider this the biggest, most visible infrastructure project in the region. It's not built completely yet. It's in the process of being built. It is a vision of a pan-Asia high-speed railway. The idea is to connect Southeast Asia to mainland, to China, the southern part of China, that's Yunnan. So the idea is to build this high-speed railway from Yunnan all the way down through Laos, to Thailand, through Malaysia, and then to connect Singapore outwards to the sea. Now, this vision, these are being built bilaterally with countries that I've just mentioned. The part with Laos has already been built, completed, and the ridership is very high. It was all constructed in time despite COVID. The portions that in Thailand are still work in process. As we know, the KL-Singapore portion has been put on hold because KL and Singapore are not able to come to agreement on how to move the project forward. So this is actually probably the most visible and largest project that you can think of in terms of high-speed rail, in terms of BRI projects. There are, of course, others that deal with, for example, building roads, highways, also special economic zones. Those are prominent parts. But when you finally put them all together, this is the one that's going to appear very high in Chinese profile in the region.
What makes China an attractive partner for Southeast Asian countries?
I can think of two key reasons why, and there could be more, why China is an attractive partner for Southeast Asian countries. One is that there is actually alignment of interest in terms of economic growth. China has been growing very well, and its growth has actually brought benefits to the region. So the region tends to think and view China's rise in a positive sense because its growth did bring about economic benefits for the region. So there's this alignment of interest. And the other thing about infrastructure building, and we were talking about the BRI, just talk about the BRI, is that the region desperately needs infrastructure. Multilateral organizations like ADB, the World Bank, can only provide a certain amount of these infrastructure funding, but the Chinese comes along and is willing to provide loans and to invest in risky projects that other countries are reluctant to take on. Now, the other thing that makes Chinese partnership attractive is that Chinese do not there are no strings attached to these projects. There is no, you must have a certain level of liberalization, you must have a certain type of government, or adopt a certain value system in order to acquire Chinese funding and technology. China does not impose such conditions, and that is attractive for many countries in this region.
How are Southeast Asian countries responding to US-China rivalry?
Two ways. Again, one is to ask and appeal to both superpowers to please keep your conflict treated as competition, and it may not necessarily be conflict. So Southeast Asians would prefer that there's healthy competition between the United States and China, while keeping the tone on conflict, the intensification of the rivalry under control, because it is not beneficial for the region as a whole, for stability for the region and economic growth in the long term, if there is real conflict breaking out. And the possibility of armed conflict over an issue like Taiwan could be something that could even be devastating, not only for the region, but for the United States and China. Now, the other position the Southeast Asian countries have taken is that please don't pressure us to take sides. We don't want to make choices. Both the United States and China have been good for the region in different ways. The United States in being a security provider, and also the United States is actually the largest foreign investor in this world, in this part of the world, and China is the region's largest trading partner. So it's really difficult to choose, and the region really doesn't want to choose. I think that's a key message that has also been sent over to the United States and China.
Yeah. Are there any incidents or anecdotes in your mind that pop up of countries kind of being pressured to choose one side or the other within the region? And of course, understanding that every country has its own interests and its own independent foreign policy as well.
Okay,
Anything that comes to mind?
Oh, okay. So I think the evidence is much more anecdotal than I think it's being carefully documented. Examples would be, whether messages from the Americans telling Singapore, and I heard this kind of messages myself. Eventually you got to think for yourself whether it benefits the region to side with the United States or to China. Do you really want an authoritarian system? Authoritarian country? Do you want to be under the influence of authoritarian country? These are the kind of messages the Americans will say, and that they will want, they will tell the region, you have to step up in the South China Sea, you have to take control of your own security instead of relying on the Americans. You've got to push back on the Chinese a bit more. And then that's the pressure from the Chinese, from the American side. Now, from the Chinese side, they're a lot more, they're less direct. I think that's somewhat cultural, I believe. They're less direct, but the pressures are indirect forms. I think Singapore went through a period of that in 2016 and 2017, when, for instance, the Hong Kong authorities actually impounded our T-Rex vehicles. They were training in Taiwan and coming back through Hong Kong to Singapore. And the Hong Kong authorities held on to it for 2 months. They didn't say anything, and Chinese authorities didn't say anything. But this is, in a way, an indirect pressure on us to cut our training in Taiwan. So that's just one example of indirect ways. And, the Americans tend to be a bit more direct in their approach to us.
Why should Americans be paying attention to Southeast Asia-China relations?
Well, first of all, Southeast Asia is one of the fastest growing economic areas in the whole world, economic region. It is vibrant. There is an economic transition in terms of growth. So this part of the world is one of the fastest growing regions. So it does benefit does benefit Americans to pay more attention to Southeast Asia. That's one reason. The other reason is that the battlefield in terms of US-China competition is going to be Southeast Asia, primarily because this is the area that's closest to China. It is, its traditional backyard, historical backyard, right, where the Chinese have most influence, whether it's cultural, whether it's economic. But the interesting thing is that even though America is not a resident power, but it is an Asia-Pacific power, or Indo-Pacific power, as the region has been renamed, as having an identity as an Indo-Pacific power, because its interests do translate to this part of the world. We have 2 American allies among Southeast Asian countries, Thailand and the Philippines, and other American allies nearby, South Korea and Japan. And Hawaii is not far away. And Taiwan is definitely also part of the region, very close by. America does have strategic interests in this part of the world, so it's both economic and strategic reasons, imperatives for Americans to pay attention to Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia's relations with China.
How can the United States be a better partner for Southeast Asian countries?
That's a great question, and that is, I think, something that the region has been sending messages to the United States about. I think there are 3 key messages that we have sent to the United States. First, you have to move beyond security, because it is the interest of this part of the world, countries in this region, to think about economic growth. And I think that the United States need to move beyond security, think about economic benefits to the region, right? So it was a huge disappointment when the United States did not rectify the TPP. He has now put up the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the IPEF, but it is not IPEF does not give market access to countries, which is one of the greatest advantages of TPP. So I think the United States need to present a more robust economic choice for the region, so the region doesn't over-rely on one country, which is China. So that's one thing, economics, be more of an economic provider and moving beyond security. The second one is perhaps not to pressure countries in the region to choose sides, because countries will make decisions based on their national interests. Too much pressure from either superpower, from the United States or China, is going to create a backlash. So it would actually behoove the United States to just not make calls for choosing sides, because countries will not choose sides as far as they can, and then the lesser possibility of a backlash. The third, I think, message that has been consistently sent to Americans is that you have to be present, to be a reliable partner. As I mentioned just now, in East Asia, the United States have 4 security partners. Now, obviously, there has been questions about reliability of the U.S. as an ally, especially for countries like Thailand, a long-term ally, but whose domestic politics is not something that America likes to see. And we know what happened when the military took over in 2014. There were sanctions imposed on Thailand, which is an ally. Now, understandably, from American value viewpoints, that this is something that they prefer not to see. But I think there's a need to recognize that there are certain expectations when you're ally of a state. You would expect that the country that you're allied with would actually help to ensure your regime stability, your regime legitimacy. So I think the U.S. will have to emphasize less on human rights, be more reliable as a partner, a security partner, even for a country like Japan. Obviously, when Trump came in, there were all these questions about making allies pay. Biden does not do that. The Biden administration has tried to build up these alliances, and knowing how important these alliances are for U.S. global power. And I think that's something that the United States need to continue doing, to be present, to be a reliable partner, attend regional meetings. So these 3 messages that the region has been sending to the United States. First, to move beyond security, think about how economically you can bring benefits to the region, how to be an alternative, to provide an alternative choice to China as an economic partner. The second is to not pressure countries to choose side, because that will create a backlash.